They found the Harbormaster by accident, which is always the best way to find anything important. The expedition was modest: one antiquarian scout ship, 2 diplomatic tenders, and a carrier full of curious bureaucrats from 3 different systems. The map keepers called themselves the Loris, their skin the color of river clay, and their hands precise with tools they had never seen. They were not looking for humans. They were looking for anything that might explain the folded charts they had intercepted in an old trade bundle. Arrays of ink and code whose logic bent like a river. Someone had put meaning there and disguised it as geography. The Harbormaster sat half-sunk among the asteroid fringe, a ring of rusted shipping gantries and plundered hulls welded into a slow, patient harbor. It had been a waypoint once, a place where humans met machines, pirates met poets, and small boats tied to the same cleat. The Loris called it an archive, the Serum pilot called it superstition. The human aboard the Loris, quiet, older than most, with hair like paper, smiled when they first passed its broken bell and said only, "Welcome home." Inside, the space smelled of oil and old paper and the distant salt of a sea that no longer existed. There were desks bolted to the deck, chairs with the dents of hands long gone, and racks of rolled charts. But the charts were not the simple star maps the Loris expected. They were maps of conversations, routes that led not through coordinates, but through questions, flows that showed how to open a door with a story rather than with a crowbar. Someone had once called the place the Harbormaster because whoever kept it understood harboring people, the art of holding, better than anyone else. The walls held scrawled instructions in dozens of tongues: how to begin a difficult talk, how to trade a lie for a truth, how to leave room for regret. There were faded photographs of hands exchanging loaf for compass, of children giving names to ships, of a council that solved a theft by giving the thief a story, not a cage. At the center of the main room there hung a map like a living thing. It was made of layers, vellum, fiber, and something woven with strands that hummed when you passed your hand over them. The map did not show where to sail, but how to arrive. It pointed at moments, the exact hour to ask forgiveness in the light, the posture to assume when offering a compromise, the song that cheapened an insult into an invitation. These were not tactics for conquest. They were a grammar for human negotiation, odd, messy, full of ritual, and somehow it worked. The Loris scientists catalogued the paper. The Serum opened sealed chests. The older human, who other crews had once called Marin the Quiet, sat on the floor and listened. It took her time to translate the edges of the map. The Harbormaster's instructions were practical, yes, but also tender. They assumed people had wounds. They expected mistakes. They did not promise victory. They promised closings. When the first outsider read the instructions aloud, nothing dramatic happened. A clock ticked elsewhere, the plumbing fixed itself, a light bulb in a back corridor that had been sputtering for years hummed solid. But over the next few days, small shifts happened. A captain apologized without losing face. A broker traded 2 cursed relics for a poem and gained both trust and a route. Word traveled slowly through docking joints. There was a map here that dealt in people. The Harbormaster had kept not treasure, but instruction. It had kept the recipe of human compromise, the notion that a stubborn argument could be unraveled by telling a better story, by admitting a small fault and asking for a larger grace. It was not elegant, it was not flawless, but it was real, honed by centuries of dealing with messy hearts. Late one evening, while the harbor bells, broken and repurposed, chimed as if remembering tide, Marin read aloud a single stanza, an old directive about tea and timing, about waiting 3 breaths before answering a threat. The Loris, who had always seen time as a straight line, blinked. For the first time in their recorded diplomacy, the Loris felt the rhythm of delay as a tool. They felt what Marin had perhaps meant. Patience can be a hull that saves both ships. That night, while the Harbormaster slept in its metal bones, the expedition dreamed of conversations they had not yet had. Small, ordinary dreams, a cup poured wrong, an apology accepted. But each one tasted like possibility. The map had not given them a quick solution, but it had returned a skill, one that seemed almost like magic because they had never been taught how to bend questions into bridges. By the time the mining tenders left the harbor, the Loris civil office was not the same. A clerk who had never tolerated the sobering of mood while binding contracts learned to pause and speak a sentence that made people laugh, and contracts signed with lighter hands. The serum captain scribbled one of the map's rituals into his logbooks, a short ritual to end an insult without a duel. Small things, but at the edges, something else began to gather, a language for making peace.
It took longer than anyone believed to realize the Harbormaster was not simply a curiosity. It was an incomplete instrument waiting for players to arrive. News of the map spread, as stories do. Crooked at first, then richer, then true. Delegations came. Not only traders or scholars, but people who had conflicts that weapons could not solve. A mining collective from Hadri turned up with a border dispute that had cost them 3 ships and a dozen lives. A family of state from Yule tried to claim a lost archive as sovereign property. The disputes were old, but the new maps suggested different unpacking. Where historically they had sent envoys that carried ultimata, now they brought questions and tea sets. Marin, who had been called quiet for so long, found herself asked to explain the grammar of the map. She laughs sometimes. How do you teach a ritual that prefers surprise? But she told stories. She argued that the Harbormaster's maps were less about what to say than about how to make saying possible. A trade could fail and still leave honor intact. A confession could lead to burial rituals that healed rather than humiliated. The map did not erase consequence. It reshaped how consequence was born. At first, the alien delegates misread the human need for ritual as superstition. They tried to replicate the steps mechanically, assuming the charm lay in the order, not the heart. A ceremony was staged on a platform, complete with ropes and banners, and it failed spectacularly. No bridges were built, only new grievances. It was then that an old broker from the Hadri, an unremarkable woman named Corey, explained what the map expected. The participants needed to bring their true weight. They had to admit, in a way their cultures had not prepared for, that they were flawed. The map wants a hand, not a script. So they learned, one by one. They swapped rituals like tools. The Loris learned the Yulian practice of slow naming. The Yulians learned the serum habit of holding space while someone finished their anger. Marin taught the trick of the pause, the 3-breath answer, and how to fold apology into action. Fix one plank of the other's dock, plant one tree, tell one true story about the cost of fists. The Hadri border was a crude test. 2 mining clans had fought over a seam that ran under 3 sovereignties.
The clans were reasonable to outsiders. They were furious with each other. The map suggested they convene, not in the seam, nor before a judge, but in the neutral harbor, under the Harbormaster's old bell, to tell the story of their best day by the sea, and the cost of the same day they had lost. The exercise was uncomfortable. Old wounds bled. But after a night of listening, the leaders did something remarkable. They swapped a claim for a promise. One clan allowed joint access in exchange for a memorial built in the other's village. The other clan took the promise and kept the seam's toll as a fund for widows in both towns. It was not a law. It was a living bargain. The Harbormaster's map had no force. It had rhythm, and rhythm made people dance and sometimes, unexpectedly, stop dancing into the sea.
Not all experiments went gently. Where the map opened paths, it also exposed soft places, memory, shame, the hunger to be better. That hunger could be dangerous. A faction in the Rim, prophet-worn and suspicious, believed the map was a weapon to change minds. They tried to replicate its grammar and propaganda. They invented rituals not to heal, but to ensnare. They wrapped promises in false apologies and used pauses as traps. The Harbormaster's teaching, stripped of its tenderness, became an instrument of control. The Harbor's council learned of the Rim's misuse when a documentary crew from 3 systems arrived, carrying footage of a festival in a mining town where a ritual, borrowed from the map, had been used to humiliate an entire minority. The footage made the rounds, and for a while the map's name was cursed. "It changes nothing," critics said. "It erases our caution." Marin refused to be quiet. She knew the map could be misread. Any grammar could. So she sat in the Harbormaster's hall and invited everyone to speak the mistakes they'd seen. She asked the Loris engineers to show the map's fibers instead of hiding them, to let folks see where strings of instruction had been woven with care. Thero, the empath linguist, insisted that the map be republished with a smaller, simpler preface. "This is not a machine. It is a practice. Use with truth." Then came the crisis that taught them why the Harbormaster mattered beyond its quaintness. 2 powerful fleets, old enemies, were set to duel at a line that crossed the harbor's plotted routes. Orders had been sent. Captains had logged coordinates. Violence, on paper, was imminent. There was no time for slow nights of storytelling. There was time for one ceremony and one unusual idea. The Harbormaster's map had a note in a faded hand. "If 2 fleets will not speak, bring them a child." Marin raised the idea, not as manipulative compassion, but as a truth-revealing mirror. The fleets were wealthy and proud. They had no children on the line of fire. But the story swap worked differently. Each fleet sent someone to tell the story they were most ashamed of in front of a neutral, unsent council and an audience of traders who had nothing to gain. It was a gamble on embarrassment. The duel paused. One captain told a story of a mistake made under his watch that had cost him years of command. The wrong coordinates, the wrong order. Another admitted they had once redirected ships to avoid a famine, and by doing so had starved another village. Each admission was a small surrender. Each surrender rolled back fury like a tide. When the captains finished, the harbor fell silent, not because weapons had failed, but because both sides recognized the staggering smallness of their grievances in the presence of human error. They agreed to withdraw for 3 days of arbitration and a common feast. The Harbormaster's map had no legal power, but it held a kind of moral gravity. People who watched shame accepted by leaders often followed suit. From that day on, the harbor's rituals were treated with skepticism and respect in the same breath. They were not miracle cures, but they worked when the people using them were sincere. And sincerity, the council learned, was the rarest resource of all.
Years later, the harbor was not the same place it had been when the expedition first stumbled into it. Where there had been rust, there were workshops teaching the old pauses. Where there had been closed registers, there were story libraries where disputes were archived with care. The Harbormaster's map had been neither weapon nor panacea. It had been a practice passed, messy and human, across species. One winter morning, which on a shipless ring meant a slow dimming of solar guttering, the harbor received a signal from systems far beyond its trade routes. A coalition of worlds was convening a tribunal, and the tribunal asked for teaching. "Show us how you make people talk so they stop killing each other," the message said plainly. Marin, older now, with the same soft laugh, boarded a slow vessel and took with her a bundle of maps, a cup of cliff tea, and the exact ritual for a 3-breath answer. She taught the delegates how to unmake a list of accusations, won by honest confession, how to fold apology into practical repair, how to offer small, tangible gestures that carried the weight of true contrition. To the Loris, she taught how song could hold a claim without burning a neighbor. To the Serum, she taught how to sit with silence until someone found their own shame and spoke. I will not say the galaxy became perfect. There were still wars, and still greedy governors, and still times when ritual was cynically staged. Rituals could be gamed. But the world that learned the maps learned a capacity to stop short of annihilation a few more times than before. A blockade that once would have turned into a massacre instead turned into a month of bargaining. A stolen archive became a shared library rather than a casus belli. Whole communities learned that closure could be engineered with art and patience instead of gunpowder. Marin sat on the harbor's last bench one night, under a sky that did not belong to any one world. Beside her, the silent map lay folded, its threads grown feeble with age. A child, Loris, human, mixed blood, climbed the bench and asked, with the bluntness of those who had not yet learned strategy, "Does it always work?" Marin smiled and watched the child's hands fumble with the map's edge. "No," she said, "not always, but it works enough." She looked out at the bell towers and the docks where ships tied to human names and alien names alike. "Sometimes," she added, "people just need to be allowed to stop pretending they're the best of themselves. When they stop pretending, they can do the hard things for the right reasons." The harbor chimed then, one beat, long and steady, as if a tide remembered its first lesson. Out in the dark, distant lights, long as hope, blinked. The Harbormaster's map was neither a miracle nor a miracle maker. It was rather a reminder that being human had been a small but powerful way of making room for each other. And when the child asked if she would teach them the ritual, Marin took a breath, 3, quietly, and began to speak.